Hey everybody, Patrick here from the Miami RC Sailing Squadron. I wanted to make a video and put it up online for people that's meant to be sort of a resource for people that are just getting into remote controlled sailboat racing. And I think that this would be a really helpful resource, especially for beginners that just sort of need to understand and visually see how we play the game and what rules are important to abide by. And what I notice in our fleet, we have a wide range of talent level. We have people that are Olympians and world champions, and then we have people that come into the club that have never sailed before. And I think a lot of times it can be very intimidating for people that have never really sailed or don't have a lot of racing experience. They can come in and feel like they don't understand the rules and that they don't want to get in the way of people that are more experienced. And I think that this is a really bad thing that we have to fix, because we want inclusivity. We want people to come and feel welcome, to feel relaxed and feel supported. And but it can be a bit overwhelming to try to explain rules down on the water, in between heats, that kind of thing. So I think having a resource online would be really helpful for us, and so people can go back and they can review it, and then it can promote discussions and just really help promote the learning curve, which is what we're always trying to do. We're always trying to get our beginners to be better and better racers, so that the quality of the racing in the club can continue to rise. Not that we need it to rise; it's already pretty bloody competitive, but it's really fun when you abide by the rules and you understand the game. Everybody has more fun. So with that in mind, we're going to review the basics of the racing rules of sailing. The first thing to think about is the racing rules of sailing is this book that's published, and it includes an appendix for remote controlled sailing. And it's a very complicated book, and people can spend their entire lives trying to understand all of the little scenarios and nuances of the racing rules. And I used to umpire and do judge work and competitively sail myself, and it's a tall order to ask someone that's new to the sport to really fully understand all of the racing rules. So I think it's important to sort of highlight the most fundamentally important ones and not overcomplicate the game. The flip side of this is, if you are an advanced racer and you're on the water and you know that you're racing against people that are less experienced than you, you probably shouldn't, call some obscure rule situation. You should probably just avoid that kind of thing. And that's sort of the responsibility of the more advanced racers out there is to, respect the basic rules, but probably don't expect, a new racer to understand some kind of strange scenario from the call book or, something weird like that. Stick to the fundamentals and everybody will have more fun. So with that said, we're going to use some videos and we're going to highlight the very basics of the sailing rules. So let's get started. Before we get to the rules, the first thing we have to do is define what a race actually is. So here's some drone shots we got from last week that sort of show how we do our racing. Now, keep in mind, every club is going to probably run a different type of race course, but they all generally have the same elements. So the race starts on a starting line, which is usually between two starting marks like this shown here, and we'll use some type of starting sequence. In our club, we use a 1-minute countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At the start of the race, you have to be below the line until the start gun goes off. If you start too early, right, if you pass the line a little bit too early, you're going to have to restart, which is obviously not going to be good for your race. Once the start goes off, we're sailing our fleet. We always do windward courses, so our first beat is always upwind to a mark, and you have to round the mark from right to left, right? So you'll see all these boats sailing upwind, and then you'll see the little red mark up here, and we're going to round this mark counterclockwise from right to left. Once we round that mark, we're going to sail straight back downwind, and then you're going to use the two starting marks, the marks that you started between, and they're going to be a gate. And what a gate is you basically can choose to round either mark, but you have to round it inside out. So the right mark, you would round in a counterclockwise turn, and if you wanted to go to the left mark, you would round that one in a clockwise turn. And the way to remember that is you always have to go inside out. And the reason we do this is to kind of make the racing a little bit more interesting and to give you some options. So if maybe you're having a bad race, you can try to make a different decision on where you're going to go, and maybe you get a beneficial wind shift or something, and then you can get back into the race. Just makes it more interesting. After we round these marks, we head back up to that upwind mark, the one you rounded first, round it the exact same way, and then go downwind again on your second lap, this time finishing through the starting line just the way you started, but in the opposite direction. So that's a winter lured twice around with a lured gate, and that's the course we use. But just keep in mind, any club you go to will have its own race course, and it's important before you start racing to understand what the course actually is. Another key piece of information you need is the difference between port and starboard tack, because that's going to be a definition we use for everything else we talk about from here on in with the rules. And so starboard tack is when the mainsail of the boat is on the left side of the boat, and port tack is the opposite, when the mainsail is on the right side of the boat. And the reason we say the mainsail, not the jib, is because with a lot of boats you can sail in a configuration that's called a wing on wing, and that's when you have the sails on opposite sides when you're going dead downwind, and you need to be able to figure out what tack you're on. So again, we define it based on what side the mainsail is on. And as you can imagine, with all of these boats sailing in close proximity to each other around predetermined marks, it's really easy for boats to get really close to one another, which is why we have to have rules of the road, just the way you have them when driving your car in traffic. If we didn't have these, then boats would crash into each other. I got a nice... Oh! Skewered! So this is why we need the rules of sailing, so that boats don't hit each other and everybody can have a fun time without damaging their boats or ruining the races. I like to teach the rules based on scenarios that you're going to see, and you can break that down into really two categories. The first category is when two boats are on opposite tacks, and the other scenario is when boats are on the same tack. And there's some more details we'll dive into both, but first let's start when boats are on opposite tacks. So we have this little animator here. Here's the blue boat sailing upwind on starboard. The yellow boat is on port, they must keep clear. In our first scenario, the yellow boat is going to duck the starboard tack boat and keep clear. But maybe the yellow boat doesn't want to duck. They have another option. Instead of ducking, they can also tack. So here, they're going to tack from port tack onto starboard tack without getting in the way of the blue boat. And this is another option to keep clear if you're a port tacker. And the same scenario applies downwind. So here we have a downwind. Blue is on starboard, yellow is on port, and the yellow boat here is ducking the starboard tacker. And just like we have upwind, instead of ducking, you could also change direction and do a jibe. So here the port tack boat, yellow boat, is deciding to jibe over and keep clear of the starboard tack boat. So either options, you can duck or you can change direction. Port starboard is a pretty simple rule to understand. Two examples of where you might run into problems. The first is upwind, when your boat is really far away from you. If you're a port tack boat doing your best to avoid a starboard tacker, it can just be difficult to figure out with depth perception how close you are. So I think a lot of honest mistakes happen with port starboards upwind like that. The other common one we see is when boats are going upwind and you have boats on other legs going downwind. So we have the blue and the white boat here on port tack going upwind, and we have three boats on starboard going downwind. Again, the port tack boats here have to keep clear of the starboard tack boats even though they're on different legs of the course. One tip that I find particularly helpful is when you're coming up to the first mark, like the blue boat here, you want to get onto starboard tack for your final approach rather early, as opposed to these boats in the lower left that were on port tack, and now as this plays out, as they're coming in, you'll see the port tack boats have to do all sorts of games and make all sorts of maneuvers to not foul someone on starboard, and it can become a big source of problems. You can hit the mark, get all wrapped up. So it's a really good idea to come into that first mark on starboard tack and give yourself the benefit of the port starboard rule to avoid bad situations. So the other scenario we need to talk about is when boats are on the same tack. And this can be broken down further into two scenarios. One, where one boat is clear ahead of the other and they're not overlapped. So here 007 is clear ahead of 71 and they're not overlapped. The other situation is you can be on the same tack and you are overlapped. So here 007 and boat 777 are both on starboard tack and they are overlapped. So we'll start with the easiest one first, when boats are not overlapped. If you are clear astern of another boat and you're on the same tack, you are not allowed to hit them. So here the blue boat is passing a luffing yellow boat and they have to not hit them in the rear end. And this is pretty intuitive. It's just sort of like driving a car. You're not allowed to rear end the car in front of you. So it's pretty easy to remember, and we rarely have many incidences with this rule. When boats become overlapped on the same tack, the rules say that the leeward boat, the downwind boat, or the yellow boat in this graphic is the right-of-way boat. So here the leeward boat can do whatever they want. They can head up from a close hauled course to head to wind if they want, and the blue boat has to stay out of their way. So when you're on the same tack and overlap, the leeward boat has right-of-way. Probably the most common rule violation we have in our fleet are windward-leeward violations on the starting line. And that's because the boats get to the line early, they're luffing, they're holding position, and everybody gets really close.
4, 3, 2, 1.
So in an ideal world, let's look at how this would play out. So we have 4 boats, and the first thing, let's freeze it here. We've got the green boat on port, the blue, yellow, and red boats are all on starboard. So the first thing we know from port starboard is that the green boat has to keep clear of the rest of them. Windward-leeward wise, we have the blue boat is leeward of the yellow boat, and the yellow boat is leeward of the red boat. So they have to keep clear of one another. So in an ideal world, if we watch this play out, we can first see that the green boat is going to tack over onto starboard to avoid the starboard tackers. And we have the red boat altering his course to make sure he doesn't run into the yellow boat. Everyone would give themselves enough space, the gun would go off, and they would sail upwind and everything would be fine.
3, 2, 1.
Ooh, all clear. 1117 did a good job. But all too often this is not the case, and the usual culprit here would be a boat like the red boat, coming in as the windward keep clearing boat and basically just sailing down the line and slamming into leeward boats and causing all sorts of messes and ruining the start for many boats. And if you don't believe me, it happens a lot. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
5, 4, 3, 2.
So of all the rules I think that people should be most aware of, situations to be most aware of, it would be that windward-leeward situation on the starting line. Coming in the starting line and just saying, oh, I can't stop, or I don't know how to stop my boat, really isn't an excuse for sailing in and hitting a leeward boat. So just work on your skills, and if you feel like you don't have the ability to stop your boat and then start your boat, then a good idea might be to hold back a little bit, maybe start a little bit less aggressively on the starting line, so then you can maybe avoid those types of situations. This is also a race management issue where we find that these types of pile-ups on the starting line between windward and leeward boats happen much more frequently when the starting line is too small. So in your local fleet, if you find that this is happening a lot, just try to make your starting line a little bit bigger, or make it a lot bigger, and you'll find that everyone will have a little bit more space to work with. And we've run plenty of races, 20, 25, 30 boats, and as long as we make the starting line big enough, we have no problems. If you make it too small, you're sort of inviting that kind of congestion, conflict, collisions, and arguments. So think ahead, make a nice big starting line, and everybody will be happier. In terms of the different scenarios you're going to encounter, that's pretty much it in terms of the most basic rules. You'll have boats either on opposite tacks, port and starboard, and we know port tack has to keep clear. And then we'll have boats that are on the same tack, not overlapped, and if you're clear astern, you can't hit someone from behind, just like in traffic in a car. Or you're on the same tack and you're overlapped, and the windward boat has to keep clear. So that's sort of like the basic fundamentals. There's another very important restriction that needs to be mentioned, people need to understand, and this has to do with what you can do when you have right-of-way. And there's sort of 2 restrictions, and the basic idea is when you have the right-of-way, you cannot change your course so quickly that another boat can't keep clear of you. So an idea with this is if you have a boat, say, to windward of you, and you're sailing along, you can't all of a sudden turn the rudder over really hard and swing up and hit them without giving them room to keep clear of you. And this is a pretty, I don't know, I think it's a pretty intuitive rule, but there can always be debate back and forth about whether or not you're giving a boat enough room to keep clear or whether they're kind of taking too long to respond to your change of course. But let's just run through one example, just sort of illustrate the rule. We have a starboard boat before the start sailing slow, with the blue boat coming in clear astern, establishing a leeward overlap, and then heading the yellow boat up almost to close hauled, and eventually making contact between the two boats. So let's break this down step by step and look at the different rules. So in the original setup here, the blue boat is clear astern of the yellow boat. So they're the keep clear boat until right here. And this is where we're gonna freeze it. At this point, the blue boat is now the leeward boat. So they've gone from not having right of way to having right of way. And there's a special rule, Rule 15, that puts some limitations on what you can do when you acquire right of way. So I'll throw it up right here. And it says, when a boat acquires right of way, she shall initially give the other boat room to keep clear, unless she acquires right of way because of the other boat's actions. So the idea here is if you put yourself into a position where you suddenly acquire right of way, that's a great thing, but you have to initially give that other boat room to respond to that new situation. If we let this then play out, we'll see another rule comes into play that's very important, and this is as the blue boat turns their course once they've become the leeward boat, this is when Rule 16 comes into play. And Rule 16 says that if you are the right of way boat and you change your course, so you turn the tiller, you have to give a boat that's trying to keep clear of you room to keep clear. And this is a pretty intuitive rule. If you're changing direction and there are boats around you, just like if you were driving a car, for example, you would want to give people around you the opportunity and the space to keep clear of you. The last rule we're going to talk about, and I swear we're almost done, has to do with rounding marks. And there are some special rules with rounding marks to make things a little bit more organized so we don't have any congestion and contact while everyone's getting sort of forced together towards this single point. And the rule is pretty basic. It means, it says that when you approach a mark, if the boats are overlapped, the outside boat has to give the inside boat room to round the mark. And the way this is defined has to do with this thing they call the zone. And the zone is a circle around a mark that is usually 3 boat lengths long, but in RC sailing, there's a change to that. It's actually 4 boat lengths long. So if you reach this circle 4 boat lengths away and you are overlapped with another boat, the outside boat has to give the inside boat room to round. So let's run through a couple scenarios just to illustrate this. So here's an example sailing upwind. We have the yellow boat and the blue boat, and they enter the zone, the circle, overlapped, which means Rule 18 applies, which means that the yellow boat has to give the blue boat room to round the mark. And that's not what happens here. If we play it again, what we see is the yellow boat turning down and sort of closing the door on the blue boat, not giving them room to navigate around the buoy. And not only that, we have to also remember that the yellow boat here is still the windward boat. So regardless of the fact that there's a mark here, windward leeward still applies as well. Now, if a boat enters the zone clear ahead, like here, the blue boat enters clear ahead of the green boat, they're no longer required to give that boat room, even if they try to take it later on. So here, the green boat's trying to force their way in, but because they entered the zone clear astern of the blue boat, they're no longer entitled to that room, and it's a penalty on green. What the green boat should have done is recognize that the blue boat entered the zone clear ahead, which means that the green boat is not entitled to sail between them and the mark. They have to wait their turn, be patient. Even though it's really tempting to try to squeeze it in there, it's best just to wait, let the blue boat go first, and then wait their turn. So this concludes sort of my introduction to racing rules of sailing for RC boats. And one thing that I really wanted to try to get across in this video is to show that the rules are complicated. There's always 2 interpretations, or even more, multiple interpretations to any one situation, and different people might look at things and have a different perspective. And it's really important to recognize that in any rules situation, there's always the possibility of there being sort of a debate about how you're interpreting what actually happened and which rule applies and why. So it's very important just to have that sort of frame of mind and not always assume that you are 100% right. Rarely are rule situations really truly black and white, cut and dry like that. There's always sort of two sides to the argument. So in general with your RC racing, it's important to have that attitude, to recognize that there's always two sides to a situation, and if someone asks you to do a penalty turn because they feel like you've broken a rule, you just do it. It's really fast, it's no big deal, and you can then have a discussion at a later time, maybe over beers after racing, draw some diagrams. I'll put some links to this software that I used in the comments below. But really what we're trying to avoid in our racing is having arguments on the dock where people are getting sort of combative and saying, my perspective, because this can quickly become unpleasant for everyone that's just trying to have a nice time on the water. So we really want to try to avoid that. One thing that we're going to start adopting in our fleet is if we have rules, situations that are unclear, I might use this software later, a few days later, and mock up the situation, and then we can have a more patient discussion about it so that we can all walk away understanding what happened. But thinking that everyone is going to understand the rules all the time in the heat of the moment is somewhat unrealistic. And so, especially if you're a more experienced sailor, being patient, sticking to the fundamentals, not arguing, and leaving those discussions until after racing will really help keep the vibe of your fleet positive and fun. You'll have more people showing up, and it's just more enjoyable for everybody. So hopefully this video was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, by all means put them in the comments, and I'll put a link to the rule book, which is free. Anyone, you can download it online, and a link to the software, and enjoy your racing and have a lot of fun. Bye.